All right, we're ready for Obadiah, and this will wind up our trimester, and we'll wind up this section of the study of the prophets for the time being. So next Sunday we start into a new trimester, and we start into, as we've been saying all along, we're filling in because there's less New Testament. We're filling in some of the gaps of bringing some Old Testament into Sunday. And so that's why we have finished up with some of the minor prophets on this trimester. So we like one more book in the New Testament, and that's the book of Revelation. And so we start it, and a whole trimester is devoted to that. So we'll spend a great deal of time in introduction. That's important in the book of Revelation, and cover chapter 1. That's what we're focusing on next time. So a number of materials are out there, some available on the internet. Some of them are not good, etc. But anyway, we'll get to that next time. So let's talk about Obadiah. This is the shortest book of the Old Testament, only one chapter. And we only have a few verses here, 21 verses, and that's the entirety of the book. Robinson called this the censure of ridicule. And if you've read the book, you understand why he says that. George Adam Smith says it was an indignant oration. And Robertson Smith said it's difficult, and its difficulty is all out of proportion to its length. I like that. For such a short book, there is some difficulty there. And we'll talk about what those difficulties are. So let's go to our questions. And look at question number 2. What does the name Obadiah mean? Servant of the Lord, worshiper of the Lord. Let's talk about the man, Obadiah. What do we know or not know about him? As already mentioned, his name means worshiper of God or servant of the Lord. And indeed, he was that. We know nothing of his background as we do some authors of the Old Testament and some prophets. Like, for example, Isaiah. We know a great deal about Isaiah. We know a great deal about Jeremiah. But we know very little about Obadiah. There are 13 men in the Old Testament by that name. Some have sought to identify him with this one and some with that one. But all of that is a matter of guess because there's no evidence to tie him with any of those. Delitzsch, for example, suggests that he is the one mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 17. But what evidence does he have? Well, really none. That we can be 100% sure. The tone of the book suggests that he was a man who was patriotic, he was a resident of Judah, and he was a man of loyalty and a man of conviction. So we do know that about him just from the tone of the book, because God used him as a prophet, tells us indeed he was a faithful man. Talk about some of the background to the book. The book obviously is about the nation of Edom, the Edomites. The Edomites were descendants of Esau. And Judah and Israel were descendants of Jacob, the brother of Esau. And there was rivalry between Esau and Jacob and their nations. And that rivalry went on for some time. Even while in the womb there was rivalry because of the favoritism of the parents. But one of the major offenses was the Edomites refused Israel passage. As they're coming through the wilderness and make their way, want to pass through Edom, Edom refused that. And Numbers chapter 20. And from that point on, there was perpetual enmity between the nations that went on for a long time. So there were enemies all through Old Testament history. We don't have time to trace this, but 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, the prophets mention this time and again. We've seen that recently in the prophet Ezekiel and Amos talked about Edom and the problems between Edom and Judah, or Edom and Israel. They were perpetual enemies, and there was perpetual hatred between the nations. And that's part of what is in the background of this book. At the time of the prophets, Edom had joined forces with the foreigners to besiege and capture Judah early in the prophets. And let me footnote right here, and listen to this carefully. Don't wedge yourself to any date that you see on the screen or you read in anywhere, because we're uncertain about the date. I'm going to suggest some dates, But don't be wedded to any date. Don't write it in ink in the margin of your text. Write it in pencil because you'll probably change your mind. But anyway, at the time of the prophets, this is talking about early in the prophets, they had joined themselves to the enemy nations fighting against Judah and Israel. So they again were perpetual enemies. That's in the background. Now, Edom was just to the south of the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea, as you can see there. And therein was part of the problem of their close location. Now, this is the date. Don't wed yourself to it, because I'm not wedded to that exactly. What is the date of the prophet Obadiah? And the answer to that is, we really don't know. I put here 845. I lean heavily often on the dates of the prophets upon Homer Haley. Homer Haley's wrong about some things, particularly some of his doctrine, a couple of major doctrines he taught. But generally with the prophets, he's fairly good with reference to dates, etc. And he wants to lean toward this 845, but the date's highly questioned. Well, you'll find a range, and so you read 10 commentaries and you may find 10 answers. You'll find it as early as one of the earliest prophets in the day of Elijah and Elisha to the day of the close of the Old Testament, 400 years, 400 BC, and about everything in between. The most common dates are 845, one of the earliest dates, and then 586. What happened in 586? There were 3 sieges on Jerusalem, and we've been seeing the third one in Ezekiel, which was in 586. Yeah, Babylon took Judah and Jerusalem fell. So those are the 2 most popular dates that are given. The most probable dates Haley suggests is 845 or 586 BC. And so the question centers around verses 10 and 11. We'll get to that in a moment. So it's either one of the earliest prophets or he's one of the latest prophets. Possibly the earliest of the writing of the writing prophets, if that early date that Haley suggests is correct, but others suggest it's a later date. So as I read through the book several times, I begin to see the argument for the early date is the fact that there is little or no reference, in fact, no reference at all to the sins of Judah or Israel. Late in 586, that was the focal point of the prophets. And so why is that missing if it's in this late date? So that argues for an earlier date. But evidence that it may be, when I get later in the book, for example, I say the book or the chapter, whichever you want to call that, for example, verse 12 harmonizes with other prophets, verse 12 and following, of the siege on Jerusalem in 586. We see some things in Ezekiel about that. And so that makes me think it's talking about maybe 586 when Jerusalem fell. So which date is it? The answer is, I don't know. I don't know. And you can pick a date, and the answer to that is, you don't know either. None of us really know the exact date of that, but we can have some conjecture. Now, it all centers around verses 10 and 11. There was an attack on Jerusalem, and who was it that was attacking Jerusalem? Babylon is not mentioned, nor is the nation mentioned that is attacking Jerusalem. But Edom was involved in that. When was that? I don't know. I don't know, but that's the big question if you're wanting to pursue that. So let's go now back to our question. What's the message of question number 5? What's the message of this book and the purpose of this book? Say again. The doom of Edom. The fall of Edom. So 2 things happen here. Primarily, it's the fall of Edom, because of their pride and their cruelty toward God's people. Secondly, the message is the exaltation of Zion, the vindication of God's people. So, verses 1 to 16 deal with the destruction of Edom. 17 to 21 deal with the exaltation of Zion. And there has to be some messianic message in that we'll come to as time permits here in just a moment. All right, let's look again at our questions. To which nation, question number 3, did he prophesy? To the southern kingdom of Judah. So we've looked at the minor prophets on this little graph. These are the 12. This is not all prophets, but these are the minor prophets, the 12 minor prophets. We classify them, as I mentioned each time, by the nation to which they prophesied and whether pre-exile or post-exile or exile. And so we have 3 post-exile prophets. We have 9 that are pre-exile and 3 that are to the north and 6 to the south. And Obadiah fits right here in the south in a pre-exile period. That's where he fits. Now, was it early in the pre-exile or late in the pre-exile? That's the question. We do not know. So where does he fit? Well, he may fit back here early in these kings in the south, or he may fit down here close to the fall, and this author that put this little graph together puts him late at 586 BC. And he may be correct. All right, now here's where we are. Let's talk about, I want to say one more thing about the message, as we were talking about the message of Judah. Message against Edom. One author suggests, this was Dave Miller, who suggested, said, notice that Obadiah gives no attention to enumerating the sins of Judah or Israel or calling them to repentance. And we see that in other prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Amos, etc., even Joel. The entire oracle is devoted to denouncing Edom. The circumstance suggests that Obadiah's ultimate aim was not to warn Edom, but to encourage and comfort Israelites. Obadiah's prophecy assists the downtrodden people of God to look forward to a brighter day when their own trauma will subside. His declaration of doom is also an oracle of optimism. And I think he's got a point, that this was to encourage downtrodden people. Well, that would fit with an earlier time, but it would especially fit at 586 BC. When the nation falls, to encourage them, there's a brighter future in the nation in the future, which would be messianic. All right, questions or comments on what the book is about and where we're going before we get into the flow of this chapter of this book? All right, 2 things happen here. There's the destruction of Edom, their perpetual enemy. We're going to see the announcement. We're going to see the reasons. We're going to see the severity of it. Then he turns, and there's the exaltation of Zion. A remnant is promised, a contrast between God's people and Edom. And then thirdly, salvation is proclaimed. I should say, I really should have worded that, is proclaimed in Zion. I think there's a reference perhaps to the apostles. We'll get to that later at verse 21. All right, let's talk about this announcement. What goes on in this announcement? A vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord concerning Edom. Now, the New King James, which I'm reading, puts a parenthesis, and I think it's well placed. And I want to skip that, and then we'll come back to that. This is what the Lord says concerning Edom. Verse 2, behold, I will make you small among the nations. That's his message to Edom. But as a parenthetical thought, and I think, remember, punctuation is all supplied by translators. This does seem to be a parenthetical thought. We heard a report from the Lord. In other words, this message came from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent out among the nations, Obadiah being one, saying, arise and let us rise up against her for battle. In other words, I worded this here, a call to the nations. God issues a call to the nations in this message or in this oracle that Edom is to fall. And Edom will fall. But it's as if God has summoned the nations to come and take care of Edom. And that they did. Ultimately, they fell under the control of Babylon a little bit later, never to rise again. Now, verse 2, here's what he says to Edom. What's the message of verse 2? Edom was, before you answer, Edom, previous to this, had flexed their muscles as far as being so important and powerful in this rivalry, and would not let the children of Israel pass through. And so they're powerful, they're mighty, they can stop. And we're pretty big, we're pretty important. What does he say here's going to happen to Edom? You're going to be brought down. You're going to be made small. In fact, you're going to be greatly despised. And so you're not going to be exalted as a great nation. You're going to be despised. You're going to be brought down and be made small. You're not as big as you think you are. All right? That's the announcement. Calls out to the nations, you're going to be despised. Verses 3 and 4, here's part of their problem. What is it? The pride of your heart has deceived you. How did it deceive them? Who dwell in the cleft of the rocks. Well, a little study of the land of Edom. There were huge clefts in rocks that provided place for safety, they thought. And I was reading this morning where they would often go out on raids and invading other places and other cities, and then they would come and run into the clefts and hide for safety. And so the clefts were their protection. And so that lifted them up with pride. We've got great protection. We have these clefts we can run into and flee for safety, and we're protected. And so he said, you're overconfident. Look at end of verse 3. You who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? In other words, this is arrogance, this is pride, and this is overconfidence that our clefts have protected us. Now verse 4, still in that first part of verse 4, though you exalt yourself high as an eagle, there is that pride. Then we're going to see that, and though you set your nest among the stars, then God's going to say what he's going to do. So let's go to point 4. What's God going to do to them? They couldn't hide from the Lord. The clefts of the rock is no protection. What's God going to do to them? 4b. He's going to bring them down. I will bring you down. You've lifted yourself up, I'm going to bring you down. God always does that to the arrogant. God always does that with people of pride. Now what's his illustration at verse 5? 2 illustrations. When a thief generally breaks in, he doesn't do blank, but he does blank. What is it? Generally, if you ever had a thief break in your house, I have. What does he do? Does he steal everything? Gets what he can till he gets all he wants. He may be looking for money, may be looking for guns, he may be looking for drugs, he may be looking for anything. But he gets what he can get and then he's gone. He doesn't make a clean haul. The grape gatherer, does he take everything? No, he leaves some behind. But when God deals with Edom, finish my sentence, he's taking it all. I'm going to clean you. I'm going to clean your plow. Taking all the treasures. Oh, how Edom shall be searched out, how his hidden treasure shall be sought after. I'm going to search out every treasure and take it. I'm like a thief. I'm going to take everything. I'm going to take every grape off your vine. I'm going to clean you. And so God's going to bring them down and leave them nothing. Now, here's some things that won't help. And let's get that, and then we'll see if there's something practical from that. What doesn't help? They're allies. Look at verse 7. What does he say about the allies? All the men of your confederacy shall force you to the border. The men at peace with you shall deceive you. In other words, they're not going to help you. In fact, some of your allies will probably turn on you. Your allies are going to turn on you. The men will deceive you and prevail against you. Those who eat bread shall lay a trap for you, and no one is aware of it. So your allies are not going to help you. Something else is not going to help you. I'm going to destroy the wise men and the understanding of the mountains of Esau. All the wisdom. There were, some suggest that there were sections of the land of Edom had some wise men who were known for their extreme wisdom. That ain't going to help you. You say, we got some wise men here, and they can think this thing through, the conflict. They ain't going to help you. Something else is not going to help you. Verse 9. Their strength, their might, their power, your mighty men of Teman, which is to the south, shall be dismayed to the end that everyone in the mountain of Esau may be cut off by slaughter. It ain't going to help. Now, let's stop for a moment. Verses 7 to 9, things that won't help. Is there anything practical in that for us? We're not Edom. We don't have an army we're trusting in. Talking about individually that we don't. We don't have allies, maybe. Yeah. When the Lord's involved, there's no way to escape. Nothing's going to help. All the wisdom that you have, how smart you are, is not going to help. All those that are encouraging you to do what you're doing, if it's doing wrong, that ain't going to help you. Any strength, any power, any might. You can outthink everybody else. You can argue your case that you're right. You befuddle people who are trying to defend the truth, and they can't answer you. That ain't going to help. Not when you're dealing with God. All right, that's the announcement. Now let's go further and see the reasons for their fall. So basically what we saw so far, Edom, you're going to fall. And I'm taking care of you. Now here's why. Look at verses 10 and 11. What was the problem? Yeah, for the violence they'd done against their brother Jacob. Well, it sounds like they had attacked Jacob. That is, they had attacked Israel, and they had. That's not his focal point, I don't think. For the violence you've done against your brother, shame shall cover you, you shall be cut off forever, in the day that you stood on the other side. In the day that strangers carried captive his forces when foreigners entered his gates. That might be 586. It might have been an earlier case, like in 2 Chronicles, as we've already mentioned. I'm not sure. And they cast lots for Jerusalem. Even you were as one of them. Now get the picture here. We're at point 1 here. They neglected to help, and in fact, they encouraged the enemy. That is, you stood off on the other side and watched as the enemy invaded Judah. And as they invaded Judah, you didn't stop them, you didn't help them, and in fact, you were as one of them. You encouraged them. Stand off on the hill clapping your hands, basically. Does that make sense? Is there anything practical in that for us? Absolutely. I may not be directly involved, but I may not be doing anything about it. What would you think if a false teacher came in during a meeting and taught error, and the 4 elders kind of sat on their thumbs over here and didn't do a thing, and shook his hand and congratulated him, and we've had a good meeting? What would you say about the 4 elders?
Just guilty of the one is teaching them.
Why? Why you say that? We didn't teach any error.
You was aware of it, and being aware of it, you were just standing against it and standing for the truth. That's your obligation as an elder. But not only elders, each and every one of us have the same obligation as the elders.
Yeah.
It's just the elders in the position of authority.
Which makes us just as guilty as he is. And that's what Edom was. You stood by and you did nothing. You didn't try to stop it. In fact, you encouraged them. You encouraged them by doing nothing. You did nothing. So that's your offense. Now, beginning at verse 12, not only did they not do anything to help, but you should not have gazed, New King James says. Footnote will say gloated over. Anybody have a different translation? You should not have gloated on the day of your brother in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor should you have spoken proudly in the day of his distress. What's that saying? When Judah fell, whether it's 586 or maybe it was another attack, yeah. Now, they rejoiced at that. Now, you stop and think about that. They didn't defend their brother. They should have. They encouraged those who did it. And when Judah fell, they're happy about that. They gloat over it. They rejoice over that. Do you remember in the book of Ezekiel, without us going back there, remember those that were kind of licking their chops like, hey, we've got our chance to go in and take some of the spoils now that Jerusalem has fallen. Edom's one of those in 586, as well as perhaps even earlier. All right, now let's look at verse 13. Not only did they rejoice in their fall, what did they do? I just mentioned. You entered the gate of my people. They took spoils in the day of their calamity. Indeed, you should not have gazed, gloated over their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. In other words, can you imagine like 2 brothers living side by side, and a thief breaks in and knocks the door in of his brother's house, and then the brother runs over and takes some spoils for himself? You think, how low can you be? That was Edom. And so whoever it is, if it's Babylon that's attacked, if that's the date we're talking about, If that's what's going on, then Edom rushes in and takes some of the spoils for themselves. That's why you're falling, is because you neglected to help, you rejoiced in the fall, and you took spoils. It gets worse. What happened in verse 14? Yeah. Those who tried to escape, they wouldn't let them escape. Remember, they wouldn't let them make passage into the land. Now, as some try to make their passage out of the land, they block them again to get right in the way. Look at verse 14. You should not have stood at the crossroads to cut off those who escaped, nor should you have delivered up those among them who remained in the day of distress. In other words, those who tried to flee from the attack of the enemy, they captured them and delivered them back to the enemy. Some suggested they sold them for slaves. Whatever the case, it wasn't either way, it was just as bad. Deliver them back to their enemy or sell them into slavery. They capture those here, people are escaping, and they round them up and capture them and then take them back and say, there's your guys that tried to get away from you. We got them. We caught them. They're no better than the enemy themselves. They're no better than Babylon or whoever the enemy was that was attacking Judah. They're no better. So you want to know why they fell? Here's 4 reasons. They neglected to help. They rejoiced in the fall. They took the spoils, and they captured those who fled. Any questions or comments on that? All right. We're still not through with this section. There's the severity of it. Verse 15a. That expression, the day of the Lord, we've talked about this repeatedly. We saw it we see it in Joel, we see it in Amos, we see it here in Obadiah, we see it all through the prophets. What does that mean? Yeah, it's a day of judgment. It can refer and does refer to the end time judgment, but not always. Sometimes it's a judgment of a nation upon another nation, a judgment in time. And so the day of the Lord is just a judgment God brings. The day of the Lord could be a famine in the Old Testament. It could be a pestilence. It could be an earthquake. And here's the day of the Lord. And so here's punishment that's coming from God. So notice at verse 15, for the day of the Lord upon all the nations is near. Now what have we learned from the prophets so far? And all of our studies of the prophets in the last little bit. Nearly every prophet has a blank section, nation section. And in those nations sections, we see God's judgment not only upon his own people, but upon the nations as a whole. And there's not a nation that will escape. So it's not like, well, I'm concerned about Judah and Israel, but I don't care about these others. They're not even going to face Judah. God's concerned about all the nations. So Obadiah is one chapter. So we don't have a section of chapters. But if you want to talk about a nation sections, it would be verse 1 and verse 15 and 16. Here's your nation section of this is the nations are going to be, judgment's coming to all the nations. Now 15b and 16 basically says what? Yeah. You've been dishing out the wrong things, and you're going to get exactly what you deserve. You're going to reap what you sow. Now let's back up and notice, here's what you've been doing. This is what you've been sowing. You're going to reap the same thing. Your spoils are going to be taken. You're going to be invaded. So let's look at verse 15. He said, your reprisal shall return upon your own head. For as you drank on my holy mountain, so shall all nations drink continually, and they shall drink and swallow, and they shall be as though they had never been. In other words, you're going to be destroyed, just like Judah was destroyed. You're going to be invaded, just like Judah was invaded. You're going to face the condemnation of God like all other nations face the condemnation of God. It's severe. It's going to be utter. It's going to be complete. Questions or comments now on the destruction of Edom, the announcement, the reasons, and the severity. Make sense? Tracking with us? All right, let's talk about the exaltation of Zion. The word remnant is not used in verse 17, but I think it's talking about a remnant. Now, you've heard me say this many times, so you finish my, there has, and there always will be. There always has been a remnant, there always will be a remnant. Now, the remnant may be small. The remnant may not be in Shelbyville. The remnant may not be in Tennessee. It may not be in the United States, but there will be a remnant somewhere. There always has been, there always will be a remnant. Well, here's a remnant promised, I think. In verse 17, but on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance. Now earlier, God's people were in the chapter I'm talking about. Earlier, God's people being attacked. And here's Edom off over here clapping their hands about that. And then God says, here's what's going to happen. You're the one's going to fall. And here's what's going to happen with Zion. There shall be deliverance. That's the promise of a remnant. And there shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. Now, from your previous study of the prophets, as you start into this, what two things are you going to expect? It may not be there if we haven't read it yet. But what are you probably expecting if there's a promise of a brighter future? Probably talking about two things. What are they? Often blended together. All right, there could be the Messianic. We'll come back to that. But first, what's the first application most likely? Whatever happens to Judah, a remnant will return. A remnant's coming back. A remnant just been promised in verse 17. So if this is talking about, and the more I read it, the more I want to kind of shift my date toward the end, maybe 586, but it might be that early date. I don't know. But if this is the invasion of Judah, then there's a promise of 586. Then there's a promise of them coming back. And any promise of a remnant is a promise of them coming back into the land. Blended with the promise of Messiah, the Messianic age. Perhaps both are going on here. Now, verse 18 starting, we have a contrast between Edom and Israel. Israel, he said, the house of Jacob and the house of Joseph is like what? Like flame and like fire. But Edom is like, which one's going to win? Fire is going to devour the stubble. In other words, one remains and the other one is gone. That's the idea. So Israel's going to remain, but Edom's going to be destroyed. That's the point of verse 18. So God's people are like a fire. The house of Esau is like stubble. They shall kindle them and devour them, and no survivor shall remain of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. If the Lord said it, that's what's going to happen. All right. Now then, verse 19. This is often mentioned in the prophets. And this seems to be a reference to bringing in of the Gentiles. The inhabitants of the south shall possess the mountains of Esau, and the inhabitants of the Philistine lowland, they shall possess the fields of Ephraim, and the fields of Samaria. Benjamin shall possess Gilead. I take that as a reference to the expanding of the borders of God's people to encompass other nations, and that the Gentiles, I take that as a reference to the Gentiles. If that's not, then I'm not sure what it's talking about. That the Gentiles will come in. And so you might write out to the margin of this section 17 to 21 that perhaps this is, in fact, not perhaps, I think this has to be messianic. That this is including the day of the Messiah. Things are going to be better and brighter under the Messiah. And you say, well, I'd like to see that. Well, you're here. You're seeing it. This is it. You are a Gentile, and that's a promise for you. Now, verse 20, Israel's going to possess their land. What do you see in verse 20? Often in the prophets, you see this referring to they're coming back into the land, and they did. Physically, literally coming back into the land. But often that phraseology is used with reference they're coming back into the land to talk about the promise under the Messiah. And perhaps there is a blending of that concept here. So Israel's going to possess their land. Now, I'm interested in verse 21. Our time is about gone. I want to get a practical lesson or two in just a second. But verse 21, as some have suggested, this may have reference to the apostles and evangelists spreading the word. The saviors, the deliverers, shall come to Mount Zion. It's plural. So I don't think it's talking about the Savior, the Messiah, but the messengers shall come to Mount Zion to judge the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. Perhaps it's talking about the spread of the message of salvation. So Edom is going to fall, and yet there's the exaltation of Zion. So here was the enemy of Edom, Zion, God's people, that they wanted to see destroyed. And actually, that's the one through whom the Messiah is going to come. And Edom is fallen to be known no more. And here is the remnant, the contrast, and the salvation that's found in the Messiah in that nation. Now, that's Obadiah. Practical lessons. Question number 6. We have a couple of minutes remaining, maybe 3. So let's see, what do you take home with you, practical, from this great book? All right. God rules in the nations and the kingdoms of men. Very good. What else? Okay, pride deceives us. I didn't catch what you said at first. Yeah, pride deceives us and leads us astray. Very good. Pride goes before destruction. Say again.
One thing I noticed that I don't know when this happened, but it's obvious God never forgot what they've done. So still pays for what they did.
Absolutely. God never forgot. What else? Good point. Good point. I want to be among his people, not among his enemies. Good point. What else? Good point. Yeah, made up of individuals. One of the things I'm learning from this is the way to escape. If you were either in Edom or Israel, Israel is going to be preserved and Edom is going to be destroyed. I want to make sure I'm not in Edom and I'm in Israel. And so I want to get to Israel as quick as I can. If you're not in Israel, then you want to get there as quick as you can. What else? We got time for 1 or 2 more. Yeah, the clefts would not help them at all. They couldn't escape from God. What else? Absolutely. I'm learning a couple of practical things there in connection with what Mitchell just said. The idea of being indifferent, standing by and doing nothing in time of distress. Maybe as parents, I'm standing by. I'm not condoning what I see, but I'm just tolerating it. That's a problem. Elders, Christians, fellow Christians, tolerating what others are doing and never trying to help and intervening when there's problems is indeed a problem. Let's get time for 1 or 2 more here. Thing you take home with you. Absolutely. God is jealous for his children. He'll do whatever he can to protect them. We should never delight in the downfall of others. And so when Edom saw Israel or Judah falling, oh, they were thrilled. And they paid a price for that. We should never delight in the downfall of others. We may not openly say that, but maybe here's somebody that's been a thorn in our flesh, and as soon as we hear they're having problems, we kind of delight and kind of, okay, I'm not going to say anything, but all right, that's good. And we should never delight in the downfall of others because we may be next. Revelation 1 and an introduction next time.